Big Shaq was enjoying a peaceful Sunday when a police car screeched to a stop. The door flew open. Officer Dawson stepped out, eyes locked on Pastor Elijah. "Step away from him," he barked. The congregation froze. Shaq frowned. But before anyone could react, boom! Dawson's fist slammed into the elderly pastor's gut. Gasps, shock. Phones shot up, recording every second. But Shaq? He didn't gasp. He didn't flinch. He just stepped forward, towering over Dawson, voice deadly calm. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." What happened next? It changed everything. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. A crisp autumn breeze rolled through the small town of Redstone as Big Shaq stood outside the local church, the morning sun casting golden light over the historic brick building. The sound of a choir warming up inside blended with the laughter of children playing near the steps. It was a picture of peace, a moment of stillness that felt untouched by the chaos of the world outside. Shaq had come to this town for a charity event, just a brief visit to support the community, shake hands, and remind people that kindness still existed. Pastor Elijah, an elderly but deeply respected leader, stood beside him, smiling warmly as he clasped Shaq's massive hand. "We're honored to have you here," the pastor said. His voice carried the weight of decades spent guiding people through life's struggles. Shaq nodded. "Feels like a good place, Pastor. A place worth protecting." Before Elijah could respond, a piercing wail split through the air. The sharp sound of a police siren. Heads turned, conversations halted, and within seconds, a squad car came screeching to a halt just a few feet away. Dust swirled as the driver's door flung open, and out stepped Officer Brad Dawson, a name that carried fear in this town. Dawson wasn't just a cop. He was a bully with a badge, a man known for harassing black residents, for throwing his weight around like he owned the place. And today, it seemed, he had found his next target. He strode forward, hand resting on his belt, eyes locked onto Pastor Elijah. "Step away from the pastor, sir," he barked, his voice sharp, laced with a false authority. Shaq frowned. "What?" Elijah lifted a wrinkled hand, calm as always. "Officer, this is my church. I'm the pastor here." Dawson smirked, shaking his head. "That's what they all say." The words sent a ripple of unease through the congregation. A few women clutched their purses tighter. A mother pulled her child closer. The air shifted from peaceful to suffocating. And then it happened. Without a single warning, Dawson's fist shot forward, slamming into Elijah's stomach. The old man gasped, stumbling back, his cane slipping from his grip as he doubled over. Gasps filled the air. A woman screamed. Phones shot up, capturing everything. Big Shaq's jaw clenched. His towering frame moved before his mind even had to process it. In an instant, he stepped in front of Elijah, placing himself between the pastor and Dawson. The officer's smirk faded as he craned his neck to look up at the man now standing in his way. Shaq's voice dropped to a dangerous, low rumble. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Dawson squared his shoulders, puffing out his chest like a rooster in a henhouse. But the moment he looked up at Shaq, his confidence wavered just a little. The towering man before him didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't even blink. The churchgoers had gone from fearful silence to angry murmurs. Someone yelled, "You can't just hit an old man!" Another demanded, "Arrest him!" But Dawson remained smug, his hand still hovering near his belt. "This doesn't concern you, big guy." Dawson spat, stepping closer. His badge gleamed under the morning sun. "Move along." Shaq didn't move. Dawson's patience snapped. He shoved a hand against Shaq's chest. Hard, but it was like pushing a brick wall. Shaq didn't budge an inch. Shaq's dark eyes locked onto Dawson, his voice slow and deliberate. "Oh, it concerns me now." The tension was thick, the kind that crackled in the air like a storm about to break. Pastor Elijah, still clutching his stomach, shook his head. "Shaq, don't." Shaq didn't need to hear the rest. His gaze stayed fixed on Dawson. The officer scoffed, stepping back and glancing around at the crowd. Phones were out, cameras recording every second of the encounter. But instead of worry, Dawson just smirked. "Y'all think filming this is gonna change anything?" He spread his arms, addressing the crowd like he was on a stage. "I run this town." Somewhere in the back, an elderly woman whispered, "Not anymore." Dawson turned back to Shaq, his smirk widening. "And what exactly do you think you're gonna do, huh?" Call your celebrity friends? Get your little fans riled up online? Shaq slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He didn't break eye contact as he pressed a button and lifted it to his ear. Dawson frowned. What do you think you're? Shaq cut him off, his deep voice calm but firm. Yeah, I need you to hear something. The crowd hushed as the call connected. A strong, authoritative voice came through the speaker. Shaq? What's going on? Dawson's smirk faltered. The voice on the other end was no celebrity. It was the last person Dawson wanted to hear. Shaq exhaled, shaking his head slightly. You're going to want to listen to this. Dawson's smirk twitched as he listened to the voice on Shaq's phone. His jaw tightened, and for the first time that morning, he looked uncertain. This is Commissioner Howard, the voice on the line said, clear and commanding. Shaq, tell me exactly what's happening. Shaq didn't take his eyes off Dawson as he spoke, his voice calm but edged with steel. I'm standing outside a church where an officer just assaulted a pastor in broad daylight. The officer's name? Brad Dawson. A silence, then a low sigh from the commissioner. Brad Dawson? The tone shifted, and it wasn't disbelief. It was recognition. Oh, we've been waiting for this. Shaq raised an eyebrow. That's so. The commissioner's voice was firm now. Listen carefully. We've been investigating Dawson for a while, but we needed hard evidence. Keep him there. I'm sending backup. Shaq's lips curled into a knowing smirk. You got it. Dawson had heard every word, but instead of backing down, he suddenly let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head like this was all a joke. Oh, that's cute. You think you can just make a phone call and end me? He reached for the radio on his shoulder, pressing the button. Dispatch, this is Officer Dawson requesting immediate backup at the church. We've got a situation involving an aggressive suspect, possibly armed. The crowd erupted in shouts. Liar! A woman screamed. He's setting Shaq up. Another voice yelled. Dawson kept grinning. Oh, relax. I'm just making sure this stays fair. Shaq's expression darkened. Fair? You just called in your buddies to cover for you. Dawson rolled his eyes. What can I say? We take care of our own. The radio crackled. Copy that, Officer Dawson. Units en route. Shaq's grip tightened around his phone. He wasn't stupid. He knew exactly what this meant. If Dawson's backup got here first, things could spiral out of control fast. The church doors swung open, and Pastor Elijah stepped forward, still clutching his stomach but standing tall. Officer, you're making a mistake. His voice, though pained, carried wisdom. You're trying to protect yourself, but the truth is already out. You can't hide from it. Dawson scoffed. Oh, spare me the sermon. But then, a sound cut through the air. Sirens. More squad cars were approaching. The question was, whose side were they on? Dawson straightened his posture, fixing his uniform like he was about to greet allies. But Shaq just folded his arms, watching as the flashing lights drew closer. A slow smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. Guess we're about to find out, he muttered. The wailing of sirens grew louder, cutting through the tense air like a blade. 4 squad cars screeched to a halt in front of the church, and before the dust had even settled, uniformed officers stepped out. But instead of approaching Dawson like the guilty man he was, they walked right up beside him, forming a solid line of authority. The church-goers murmured in confusion, their hope flickering. Weren't these supposed to be the good guys? Dawson smirked, dusting off his badge like he had just won. Gentlemen, he said smoothly, glad you could make it. Shaq kept his arms crossed, scanning their faces. Something was off. These men weren't here for justice. They were here to cover for their own. One of them, Officer Tate, stepped forward and addressed the crowd. Folks, this situation is under control. I suggest you all clear the area. A woman near the front, still holding her phone up, shook her head. Not a chance. We saw what happened. Tate narrowed his eyes. With a swift motion, he snatched the phone out of her hands. No filming allowed. Gasps rippled through the congregation. Shaq, standing tall and unmoving, finally spoke. Bad move, he said, his deep voice cutting through the noise like thunder. Tate turned to him, unimpressed. Oh yeah? And why's that? Shaq pointed a massive finger toward the corner of the church. Mounted high on the building, blinking red, was a security camera. Because now you've messed up big time, Shaq said, a smirk curling his lips. Tate's head jerked up. Dawson's smirk faltered. The weight of their mistake sank in instantly. Every single second of what had happened. Dawson's assault on Pastor Elijah, his corrupt buddies arriving, the intimidation, was all on tape. And that footage? It wasn't going anywhere. The crowd, sensing the shift in power, started whispering. "You're done," a man muttered. "They can't hide this," another woman said. Dawson clenched his jaw, but before he could react, the low rumble of an approaching vehicle turned every head. A sleek black SUV rolled up slowly, its engine humming with quiet authority. It came to a stop right behind the police cars. The tinted door swung open, and a man in a sharp black suit stepped out. His expression was unreadable. His presence? Unmistakable. The air shifted, thick with anticipation. Dawson took a step back, his confidence cracking. Shaq's smirk widened. "Looks like your real backup just arrived." The sound of tires crunching against gravel drew every eye toward the sleek black SUV pulling up beside the flashing squad cars. The once rowdy tension among the officers and the gathered churchgoers shifted into an uneasy silence as the vehicle's tinted door swung open. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark suit and aviator sunglasses stepped out with purpose. He exuded authority, not the brash, abusive kind Dawson was used to wielding, but the kind that made even the guilty hold their breath. Dawson squinted, his cocky smirk faltering. "And who the hell are you?" he scoffed, though his grip on his belt tightened. The man ignored him. Instead, he walked straight past Shaq, nodding slightly in recognition, and stopped inches away from Dawson, his expression unreadable. He pulled out a sleek black leather badge holder and flipped it open. "Agent Marshall, FBI." His voice was calm, firm. "And you, Officer Dawson, are under federal investigation." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Church members clutched their phones tighter, recording every second, while the other officers shifted on their feet, uncertainty creeping onto their faces. Dawson let out a bark of laughter, though the way his shoulders tensed betrayed his bravado. "For what?" he sneered. "Doing my job?" Agent Marshall didn't react. Instead, he turned his head slightly, motioning toward one of the squad cars. "Pop the trunk." A uniformed agent near the SUV pressed a key fob, and with a soft click, the trunk lid lifted. Gasps rippled through the onlookers as they saw what was inside. Piles of cash, unmarked evidence bags stuffed with seized drugs, and an unregistered firearm resting on top. Dawson's face drained of color. Shaq exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Man," he muttered, crossing his arms, "you just made this way too easy." The congregation erupted in whispers, some glancing at one another in shock, others nodding knowingly, as if this confirmed suspicions long held but never proven. "I suggest you take a good look, officer," Marshall continued, his voice carrying over the stunned silence. "Because this is what happens when you think you're untouchable." Dawson took a stumbling step back, his eyes darting toward his fellow officers, looking for backup. But their loyalty wavered. One of the younger cops, barely out of the academy, swallowed hard and turned away, as if realizing for the first time he had chosen the wrong side. Still, Dawson straightened, his jaw clenching. "This is a setup," he growled. "You ain't got nothing on me. Shaq cut him off with a low chuckle, shaking his head. "You really don't know when you're beat, do you?" Dawson's breathing grew shallow, his hand twitching toward his holster. Before anyone could react, Dawson made his move. The moment the trunk opened, the air in the churchyard grew heavy with tension. Bundles of cash, vacuum-sealed evidence bags of narcotics, and an unregistered firearm sat in plain view beneath the afternoon sun. The weight of the revelation settled over the crowd like a thunderclap. Gasps broke the silence. Murmurs spread like wildfire, and the previously composed expressions of Dawson's fellow officers wavered between shock and unease. Agent Marshall didn't so much as blink. "Well," he said, his voice steady, "that certainly explains a lot." One of the younger officers took a step back, his face pale. "Dawson, what is this?" Dawson's bravado faltered for the first time. His smirk twitched, his fingers flexed at his sides, and his eyes darted between the trunk and his squad. It's a setup," he barked, though even he didn't sound convinced. "They planted it. You think I'm stupid enough to leave all that in my own trunk?" Shaq chuckled, low and unimpressed. "I think you're stupid enough to believe you'd never get caught." The crowd murmured in agreement, their growing outrage fueling the moment. Pastor Elijah, still holding his stomach from Dawson's earlier assault, shook his head in disgust. "And you wore that badge like it meant something." The heat rose in Dawson's face, his confidence rapidly slipping. He turned sharply to his officers. "Are you seriously buying this?" His voice cracked as he gestured toward the investigator. This is a witch hunt. You think these feds care about you? About this town? But his men weren't rallying behind him. Instead, one of them, an officer who had been standing in quiet uncertainty, slowly reached for the badge pinned to his chest, unhooked it, and tossed it onto the ground at Dawson's feet. I didn't sign up for this, he muttered, shaking his head. Dawson's breathing grew erratic. His jaw clenched so tightly it looked as though his teeth might shatter. His eyes flickered toward Shaq, filled with nothing but unfiltered rage. Shaq smirked, arms crossed. Looks like someone's been a bad cop. Dawson's nostrils flared. And then, without warning, he bolted. The crowd erupted in gasps as Dawson spun on his heel and took off, shoving past his fellow officers, his boots kicking up dirt as he sprinted toward the squad car at the edge of the lot. Agent Marshall sighed, unamused. That's adorable. Shaq, however, had already moved. In an instant, he was on Dawson's heels, his long strides covering twice the ground with half the effort. The officer barely had time to register the thunderous steps behind him before Shaq's massive hand gripped the back of his collar. With a single, effortless yank, Shaq lifted Dawson clean off his feet. Dawson ran as if his life depended on it, his boots pounding against the pavement in frantic, uneven strides. His breath came in sharp gasps, his arms pumping wildly as he lunged toward the nearest squad car. His only chance now was escape. If he could just get to the wheel, just disappear for long enough. Maybe he could spin this. Maybe he could talk his way out of it like he always had before. But he had one massive problem. Shaq. The moment Dawson took his first step, Shaq was already moving. Despite his towering frame, he was shockingly fast, his long strides closing the distance with terrifying ease. The ground trembled beneath his weight, his sharp focus locked onto his target. Dawson barely had time to reach for the car door when a shadow loomed over him. Before he could react, an iron grip clamped onto the back of his collar. His feet left the ground. The world tilted as Dawson was yanked backward like a rag doll, his arms flailing as he let out a choked yell. Shaq lifted him effortlessly, holding him up like he weighed nothing at all. "Let me go!" Dawson shouted, kicking wildly in the air, his voice cracking with panic. He twisted and writhed, his face red with humiliation as the congregation, and half the town, watched the so-called toughest cop in Redstone get handled like a misbehaving child. Shaq, entirely unfazed, turned and began walking back toward the investigator, carrying Dawson like he was hauling a sack of potatoes. "You were saying?" Shaq asked, his voice smooth, unbothered. Agent Marshall waited, arms crossed, his face unreadable as Shaq deposited Dawson directly in front of him. Dawson landed on his feet but stumbled, barely catching himself before falling. Marshall didn't hesitate. He reached into his coat and pulled out a pair of steel handcuffs. "Brad Dawson," the agent said, his voice calm but firm. "You're under arrest." Dawson's eyes went wide. "Wait, no, you can't do this. I'm a cop. The cold snap of the cuffs locking around his wrists silenced him. The moment the cuffs clicked shut, the crowd erupted in cheers. The handcuffs were barely locked around Dawson's wrists when the sound of more engines rumbled in the distance. The onlookers turned their heads as a convoy of sleek black SUVs rolled into town, their tinted windows gleaming under the midday sun. The energy in the air shifted instantly. This wasn't just another set of local cops. This was bigger. Agent Marshall straightened his tie as the first vehicle's door swung open. Out stepped a stern-faced man in a dark blue suit, his badge flashing under the sunlight. More federal agents followed, moving with precision and purpose, their expressions unreadable. One of them, a tall woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor, walked straight up to Marshall. "We got the files," she said briskly, handing him a thick folder. "It's worse than we thought." Marshall flipped it open, his expression darkening as he scanned the documents. He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "I knew Dawson was dirty," he muttered. "But this is next level." Shaq crossed his arms. "What are we looking at?" Marshall exhaled sharply and held up a photograph from the file. An image of Dawson, not in his police uniform, but sitting at a high-end restaurant, laughing with none other than Mayor Richard Calloway, the same mayor who had been in office for nearly a decade, the same mayor who had mysteriously shut down every internal investigation into police misconduct. "Dawson isn't just some rogue cop," Marshall said grimly. "He was protected, and the man protecting him, the mayor himself." The crowd gasped. The very people who had feared Dawson for years had also been voting for the man keeping him in power. The weight of betrayal settled over them like a thick fog. Dawson, still in cuffs, let out a short, bitter laugh. "You really think you can touch him?" he sneered. "You take me down. You'll have an army of lawyers up your ass before sundown." Marshall didn't even flinch. "That's so?" He held up another document. "Because according to this, the mayor has been laundering money through police department budgets for years. And now we have the receipts." Dawson's smirk wavered. Shaq took a step forward, towering over him. "You were just a small part of this," he said, his voice even but heavy with authority. "But the whole damn system is coming down with you." The congregation erupted into murmurs. Fear was shifting into something new, something powerful. "What now?" Shaq asked, turning to Marshall. The agent tucked the files back into his briefcase. "Now?" He glanced toward the growing crowd, his eyes locking onto the dozens of phones recording. "Now, we take down the whole system." Just then, the wail of another set of sirens filled the air. But this time, they weren't police. A news van screeched to a stop at the edge of the scene, and a reporter leaped out, microphone in hand. The cameras turned, lenses zooming in. This was about to go public. The camera's red recording light blinked to life as the news crew rushed onto the scene, shoving microphones toward Shaq and the federal agents. A blonde-haired reporter in a navy blazer, her face tense with excitement, pushed to the front. "Shaq, you just took down a corrupt cop in front of the whole town. People are calling you a hero." She held the mic closer, her voice breathless. "What do you have to say?" Shaq stood tall, his expression unreadable. He could feel the weight of the crowd's anticipation pressing in around him, but he wasn't here for praise. His deep voice rumbled through the air. "This ain't about me," he said, locking eyes with the camera. "It's about justice. It's about a man who thought he was untouchable, finally answering for what he's done." The people in the crowd murmured in agreement, their energy shifting. Some nodded, others clenched their fists. Years of pent-up frustration finally finding an outlet. The reporter turned to Marshall. "Agent, what happens next?" Marshall, still holding the folder of evidence, exhaled. "Brad Dawson will be charged at the federal level, but we're not stopping there. The investigation into Mayor Calloway is officially open." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The mayor? The man who had been shaking hands at charity events, cutting ribbons at schools, giving speeches about protecting the community? If he was involved, this wasn't just about Dawson, it was about the entire power structure of the city. Dawson, still in cuffs, snarled, "This is all bull. My lawyer's gonna have me out by sundown." Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. "You still don't get it, do you?" He gestured toward the cameras. "You ain't getting out of this one. Not this time." Just then, miles away, inside a lavish penthouse apartment, a woman sat frozen in front of her TV. Dawson's wife, Meredith, clutched a glass of wine in one hand, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the stem. Her other hand hovered over her phone, shaking. She had spent years turning a blind eye to her husband's corruption, convincing herself it wasn't her problem. But now the world was watching, and she knew something that could bring it all crashing down. Meredith's hands trembled as she grabbed her phone. Was she about to expose everything? Meredith Dawson's fingers hovered over the Go Live button on her phone. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it over the muffled voices of news anchors echoing from the television. She had spent years trapped in silence, buried under the weight of her husband's corruption, his violence, his absolute belief that he was untouchable. But now the world was watching. With a deep breath, she tapped the screen. Within seconds, the notification spread like wildfire. "Meredith Dawson is live." The video feed flickered to life, revealing her shaken face. Her usually pristine makeup was smeared, her eyes red-rimmed. Her lips trembled, but she forced herself to speak. "My name is Meredith Dawson," she began, her voice tight with emotion, "and I've been living a lie." Thousands tuned in within seconds. News stations scrambled to screen record. She swallowed hard, gripping the phone as if letting go would break her resolve. "For years, I told myself I had no choice but to stay silent. But I can't do that anymore." At the church, Shaq's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, his eyes narrowing as he saw the live feed. Pastor Elijah, standing beside him, whispered, "What is she doing?" Shaq didn't answer. He just watched. Meredith continued, her voice growing stronger. "Brad Dawson isn't just a dirty cop. He's an abuser, a liar, a monster. Gasps filled the live chat as comments poured in. What is she saying? This just got real. Expose him, sis. She pulled in a shaky breath. I have proof. Text messages, bank statements, recorded conversations. I know where the bodies are buried. Literal. At that moment inside the police car, Brad Dawson's blood ran cold. He had been sitting in silence, stewing in rage. But now? Now his wife was doing something he never thought she'd have the courage to do. No! Dawson roared, yanking against his cuffs. She's lying! She's lying! The federal investigator raised an eyebrow. I don't know, Dawson. She sounds pretty damn convincing to me. The crowd around the church erupted into murmurs, people pulling out their phones to watch. The tide was turning, fast. On the live stream, Meredith's voice didn't waver. Brad always said he owned this town, that no one could touch him. Her eyes burned into the camera. But he was wrong. And now it's over. The city was no longer just watching. They were rising up. Dawson wasn't just going to jail. His entire empire was crumbling. The air inside the packed courtroom felt thick with anticipation. Every seat was filled. Community members, reporters, officers from other districts. Even the mayor sat stiffly in the back, his face pale as if he knew his turn was coming. The judge adjusted his glasses and let out a slow breath. He had seen his fair share of criminals, but Brad Dawson? He represented something far worse. Bradley Dawson, the judge's voice echoed through the silent room. You have abused your position. You have betrayed the very people you swore to protect. And worst of all, you showed no remorse. Dawson sat at the defense table, his face twisted in barely contained rage. His lawyer had stopped trying to argue hours ago. There was nothing left to defend. Not after the evidence, not after his wife's explosive testimony, not after the entire world watched him be exposed in real time. Shaq stood near the front, arms crossed over his chest, towering over most of the people in the room. Beside him, Pastor Elijah sat upright, his ribs still sore from Dawson's attack, but his spirit unshaken. He watched the judge with quiet satisfaction. The judge cleared his throat, delivering the final blow. I hereby sentence you to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, cheers, the sound of reporters typing furiously. But the loudest noise came from Dawson himself. This is a joke, he roared, standing so violently that the bailiff had to hold him down. I own this town. You hear me? His face turned red, veins bulging. You can't do this to me. Shaq stepped forward, shaking his head. Looks like the town decided otherwise. Dawson's eyes locked onto Shaq, filled with pure hatred. You think this is over? His voice dropped, dripping with venom. There are more like me. You'll never clean this place up. Pastor Elijah placed a firm hand on Shaq's arm, his voice calm but strong. Then we start today. Shaq turned to the crowd, his eyes scanning the determined faces. The battle against Dawson was won, but the war for justice? That was just beginning. The sun cast a golden glow over the town of Redstone, illuminating a scene that had once been drenched in fear. The once intimidating police station, now under new leadership, stood as a symbol of change. Outside the small community church, a crowd had gathered. Families, business owners, former victims of corruption, all standing together in unity. At the center of it all was Big Shaq. The church doors swung open, and Pastor Elijah stepped forward, his face beaming with gratitude. Though his movements were still a bit slow from the attack he had endured, his spirit remained unshaken. He raised a hand to quiet the crowd. My brothers and sisters, Elijah's voice echoed, today we don't just celebrate justice, we celebrate a new beginning. Applause rippled through the crowd. Shaq, leaning against a black SUV, watched with a quiet smile. He wasn't here for applause. He wasn't here for thanks. He had done what needed to be done, and now the real work was beginning. The mayor, now scrambling to save face, had publicly pledged to clean house. The FBI was investigating every corrupt officer Dawson had worked with. And most importantly, Shaq had personally ensured funding for a new community justice program, one that would provide legal aid, mentorship, and protection for those who had suffered under Dawson's reign. A young girl tugged at her mother's sleeve and pointed at Shaq. Mommy, is he a superhero? Shaq knelt down, meeting her eyes with a soft grin. Superheroes wear capes, kid. I just wear size 22 shoes. The crowd laughed, the tension that had gripped this town for years finally starting to ease. Pastor Elijah stepped forward, placing a hand on Shaq's shoulder. We wouldn't be standing here without you. Shaq shook his head. You all stood up for yourselves. I just made sure someone was listening. The crowd erupted again, cheers filling the air as a local news van parked nearby. A reporter stepped out, microphone in hand, her cameraman already recording. Mr. O'Neill, she began, the world is calling you a hero. What do you have to say? Shaq thought for a moment, then gave a simple nod. Justice ain't just about taking down bad guys. It's about making sure good people don't have to fight alone. The reporter smiled. And what's next for you? Shaq glanced toward the horizon, then back at the church. Whatever town needs me next. Hours later, news headlines exploded across every major platform. Big Shaq destroys corrupt cops and saves a whole city.